Bueno, estamos platicando con el coordinador de este reporte Acabando con la guerra contra las drogas, con John Collins, y con Armando Santacruz, quien es consejero de México Unido contra la Delincuencia. And why don't you repeat your question so we can go to the solutions of the problem?
Yeah, the question, it seems, is that we need cooperation between countries. This needs to be tackled certainly at a regional level, probably at a global level. Yet there seems to be different incentives and different interests between consumer countries and producer and transit countries. And the question is, if there are different incentives, how can you achieve cooperation? It would seem, from the Colkin paper, it would seem that prohibition or some sort of prohibition makes sense for consumer countries, but not for producing and transit countries. So how do you get around that issue?
Well, I think it's very country specific, and I think the argument that John Calkins is making is very valid for the US, in that you don't have partially legalized markets. You have something that's legal or illegal, and if you see it's legal, it becomes commercialized, and you can't really control it. So you see it with tobacco, you see it with alcohol in the US, you see it with firearms in the US. It's very hard to put controls on certain commodities, and that's the argument that he's making. If you legalize, you have to beware of the fact that you could have potential enormous industries who are dropping prices drastically, who are targeting problematic consumers to increase their consumption. It's what Mark Kleiman highlights in the report as well when he's talking about cannabis regulation. The thing is, other countries don't have the same problems. So Uruguay was able to put in very strict regulations around cannabis. The state is able to direct that. The state is able to regulate it and control it in a way that prices don't fall too drastically and that consumption doesn't increase too drastically. So it is country specific. And yes, if it's a case of prohibition versus outright commercialization and just free-for-all legalization, I think the Calkins argument stands up very much more strongly against that, and maybe in the US context that matters. But other countries should be able to regulate and legalize to a better extent, I think, or to end prohibition to a far less harmful way.
Now, I heard the argument here in Mexico that legalization is only a solution for precisely the countries that they have a demand problem, a problem of consumption and addiction, that it's not our solution, that our problem is supply, so our solution is not legalization. Why legalization is also our solution?
Let me tell you several arguments for Mexico.
No, but I have heard that.
Let me start by saying that it is not a magic bullet.
Yeah.
And why? Because once you've created these monsters, these huge criminal enterprises, they diversified. So let's assume that we took away all the drug business. Now we would have to deal with the kidnapping and the other things that they're already doing. It's not true that they're going to diversify once we take the business away. But there's other benefits in here. First of all, narcomenudeo, the selling of small portions, entails a lot of violence, so you would get rid of that violence. Secondly, and I think this is very important, you would separate consumers from the criminal markets. In other words, nowadays when a young kid wants to buy dope, he goes to a dealer. Goes to the dealer, and the dealer says, okay, here's your drug, and by the way, don't you want a little coke? No, I don't really do coke. Come on, take it. No, I don't have money. Take it. You'll pay it later. Don't even pay it. Doesn't matter. And you start with this whole criminal enterprise and criminal chain.
They get hooked with
either they get hooked. They might not even get hooked. Let's say with a drug, but they might get hooked with a business. If the guy says, "I'll give you some and I'll finance it," and you sell it, so you're putting in contact people who are not criminals, because most, a politically incorrect thing to say, but which is true and which the Portuguese have acknowledged a long time ago, is that the majority of drug users are not problematic users. So most drug users are casual users and don't have a problem. So if those people are separated from the criminal markets, you will have a much higher chance of them not being hooked on newer substances or involved in criminal actions. And the second thing, which I was saying at the beginning, is you get rid of the violence involved in narcomenudeo. And also you will hit the profits of the cartels. And I think anything that hits the profits of organized crime helps to redimension the fight between the state and organized crime. So there are good arguments for that.
If I may, I don't want to give a false impression that this report is arguing for legalization or anything like that. What we're saying is we're trying to elaborate next steps towards ending the drug wars and de-escalating. In terms of cannabis, regulation is happening. So it's about a case of can we do smart regulation? What can we learn from that? And then potentially.
But it's legalization with regulation.
With
no?
legalization
Absolutely.
with very strict regulation is what we advocate. And then it's potentially we'll learn things from that we can apply to other substances later. But around what's called the heavy majors, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, there's no talk of legalization in the immediate future. But we can move towards this idea of a more rational implementation of prohibition, and that's a drastic de-escalation of resources. That's taking money away from police and military. That's increasing the amount of money that goes to treatment, to health services, to harm reduction services, things that actually we know do work. And then in the Mexican context, it's about focusing on violence. It's about getting rid of this metric of how many tons were seized or how many kilos were seized, how many people were arrested, what capos were killed by police. These are utterly pointless metrics that tell us nothing about drug policy. So it's about redirecting police and resources towards minimizing violence, minimizing harms, minimizing corruption. And those are the next steps towards ending the drug wars.
And just along those lines, there's, I think, two very important things. One important thing is that when you are jailing people who are either users or just small-time traffickers, you're actually creating much higher cost to society than dealing with them through other means. And with the current way of attacking the problem, you're actually destroying a lot of lives and spending a lot of time and money with these people in the prisons. And secondly, police is diverting its efforts from the crimes that really hurt most people, which are predatory crimes. And even in the States, there are statistics that prove that the rates of impunity for murder, for rape and other violent crimes have grown in the last decades as a result of police being highly focused on pursuing drug crimes. So it's much better for society to have police focusing on pursuing predatory crimes rather than consensual crimes.
Who would you say is going about this sort of problem in the right way? Who's the best practice? Or is that, again, a country-specific thing and difficult to export solutions between countries? But if you had to sort of pick the countries that you would say have adopted a different strategy and it seems to be working, Portugal?
I think it is country specific. I think if you look at Europe, the reason that Europe doesn't factor as a major player in the international debate is because drug policy is managed there. It's not great. There's a lot of things that it can improve massively on, but it's not as extreme as you see it in the US, and it's not as extreme as you see it in Latin America in terms of the levels of violence. And then within Europe, yeah, there are specific players who've done particularly good jobs. I think Switzerland is an example of a country. You know, they've medicalized problematic heroin consumption. Harm reduction services are well serviced, and generally throughout Europe harm reduction services are well serviced. You know what I mean when I say harm reduction services: syringe exchange, access to treatment, but access to substitution therapy, these kind of things. Czech Republic is an example of a former Soviet state which has done a very good job. They never pursued the war on drugs after the fall of the Berlin Wall. They pursued their own kind of minimalized strategy, and what you see is countries that pursue these strategies have much less problematic drug use. They have far lower rates of HIV transmission. They have far lower rates of violent crime, these sorts of things.
How about producer countries? Is there different policies in different producer countries, and are some doing a better job than others, or are they all pretty much doing the same thing?
I think it's hard to extrapolate across countries and across long periods of time, but I think Colombia has done some things that are correct in terms of they quietly have de-emphasized ideas around eradicating the supply. It's about minimizing the harms to society. They keep much of the rhetoric the same, but I think you see a number of states following that. I think Peru, you're actually seeing the debate starting to open up. It certainly hasn't improved policy in a practical sense, but you see
Bolivia?
Bolivia, I think it's too early to tell, but the issue with coca leaves, I think, is actually a pragmatic step forward. I think there's no reason to push back against what they're doing.
And just, to add on this, Portugal is actually a transit state. It's not a production state, but it's a transit state. The majority of the drug that goes into Portugal is for further use downwards in Europe. So in that sense, it has certain similarities to several of our countries, like cocaine in our case. And secondly, I totally agree, in Colombia, there has been a deliberate effort to emphasize violence reduction rather than drug production. And you can see the change in the homicide rates, in the kidnapping rates, and in the freeing up of highways, which 10 years ago were totally intransitable in Colombia.
And we are not seeing that in Mexico with Peña Nieto right now. You don't think he's de-emphasizing the drug part of the business of
the fight against organized crime.
Exactly, organized crime?
I think we still don't have enough information. From a rhetorical point of view, at least they are.
Yes,
I think that they certainly have de-emphasized the huge shows of grabbing capos.
Yes.
Although I'm not too clear in whether the strategy is still there of saying we're going to concentrate on the violent guys.
Okay.
And once we get over the violent guys, then we might look after the other guys.
Okay.
Is there a problem of being a first mover on this issue? On lots of issues, it makes sense to be a first mover. But maybe on this issue it makes sense not to be the first mover, to see what happens in Uruguay, to see what happens in Colorado, to see what happens in lots of places before you make a move. Is that an issue? Is that a problem?
Yeah, I think there's two aspects of that. I think there's political costs and I think there's practical costs. And in terms of political costs, it used to be that the UN is an extremely conservative institution on this issue. There's a group called the International Narcotics Control Body, which has a treaty mandate around access to medicines, but decides that it goes around and gives press conferences castigating countries that it disagrees with. The US used to do the same. They threatened to cut off funds, trade, all sorts of things. That's not happening to the same extent that it was. But certainly 4 or 5 years ago, the political costs for a country talking outside the current paradigm were enormous, and that's why you didn't actually see that many doing it. That has diminished. In terms of, yes, the practical costs, Uruguay, there will be some mistakes around regulation initially, and we will learn from those and we will try to correct those. And so there is a cost for the countries that are the first to do it, that they bear some of those sounding out costs. And frankly, as Mark Lyman says in the report, we all benefit from that. We all learn from that.
But I think we can go halfway through, which is, for example, what the PRD was trying to push in the local assembly, in la Asamblea de Representantes. That initiative was actually quite well reasoned. It was smart. It would get rid of many of the problems that we actually had. We would still have the backdoor problem, like in Holland, but in many ways, difficult issues like these, many times you have to go for the imperfect solution. Lo perfecto es enemigo de lo bueno, as we say in Mexico. So it was a great first step. And I think we could do things like that in Mexico without having to really gamble on a massive scale. And also, every country that has done something here has done trial and error. The Swiss, before reaching the medical heroin stage where they are right now, which has been very successful, they had some very, very bad experiences with the park in Zurich and other things. But that's the way they approach it. They said, well, let's try, and we can always backtrack and push forward and backtrack, and it's the only way to go ahead. And what's certainly true is that the status quo is not working.
Exactly. For those of us that are really convinced that the prohibition has been a failure, we have to win another war, which is the war of public opinion. How we are going to win that war? I mean, actually you have to do these kind of reports, but it's not easy because there are many prejudices, there are many conservatives. Exactly. So how we are going to win this war?
It's a very difficult one to make, and I think you never have a discussion with somebody when you explain the facts, when you explain the figures, that they don't start at a point, well, just throw everyone in jail who's ever looked at a drug, to move towards a more kind of, well, okay, it is a public health issue. It is an issue where it's treatment over incarceration, those kind of things. But it's problematic, and I think it is a case of we need opinion leaders to come out on this issue. This is what this report is an attempt to be from an academic level. You have the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which is former Latin American presidents, world leaders coming out on this. You have the West Africa Commission on Drug Policy, which is chaired by Kofi Annan, former UN Secretary General, saying that this is going to be a disaster in terms of development from West Africa. What we saw play out in Latin America is going to play out in Africa now, and he's highlighting that. He's trying to get ahead of the curve on that. So I think it is a case of opinion makers, opinion leaders need to get involved and discuss this issue.
But we are winning, no?
I think we are seeing a change. When we started this at Mexico Unido, we got involved 3.5 years ago. And at the time, you were basically almost thrown out of every forum when you came up with these things. And now, quite honestly, we have very productive discussions with, for example, senators and congressmen from all parties, which is interesting, which we didn't have in the past, where we actually have a civilized discussion. And secondly, people are starting to understand that, as you can tell someone, what would you rather have your kid face if they're caught with drugs, a doctor or a policeman? And everyone says, well, a doctor. Well, it's a medical problem, let's face it, in a medical way. And regulation will always be lacking in Mexico, and it will always be imperfect with the states with the deficiencies of Mexico. But a poor regulation will always be better than no regulation. Drugs in the hands of the drug cartels will always be more dangerous than drugs controlled by the state.
Absolutely.
And that's a bit of what our argument is. We'd rather have a poor regulation than no regulation, just as with tobacco. Tobacco has been showing signs of success.
Yeah,
tobacco
absolutely.
use in Mexico has been going down once the state decided to intervene vigorously.
And tobacco was following a public health model. It's that you educate the public, you can show them the details and you show them the harms and you convince them not to do it. It's not through a criminalized prohibitionist framework that we decrease tobacco consumption.
We have time for one more.
What role does morality play in all this? A lot of people would say that the reason killing someone is illegal has nothing to do with a cost-benefit analysis, just plain wrong to kill somebody. What would you say to somebody who says, I don't care about your cost-benefit analysis, just plain wrong to take drugs?
Well, from somebody who's a historian of the system, it's totally arbitrary why certain drugs are illegal relative to others. And there's a brilliant psychologist in the US, Dr. Carl Hart, he's based at Columbia University, and he highlights that a lot of the prescription medicines given to kids for ADD are exactly the same as methamphetamine pharmacologically. The difference between cocaine and crack cocaine is there is no difference pharmacologically. It's who is perceived to use them that is often determined what drugs are legal and what are illegal. So there's just it can't be about morality because they're totally arbitrary distinctions based on, if we look at them scientifically and rationally, there's no reasons why certain drugs are illegal relative to others. The most lethal drug in the world is tobacco. We don't criminalize that. We don't look at it as a morality issue.
And the second one is alcohol.
Yes, and certainly the most, in terms of social cost, the most harmful is alcohol.
Yeah.
You know, currently we have a group of people in Mexico. We set up a cannabis production cooperative, which was rejected by COFEPRIS, and we have litigated up to the Supreme Court. And what we're waiting for is for a ruling, because it's based on civil liberties, saying I have the right to use whichever drug I please as long as I don't hurt anybody else. The state has no place telling me what to do with my body. If someone throws himself from a building and falls and doesn't die, they immediately bring an ambulance and help them and try to save him. While someone who's used the drug is put in jail. That's a total paradox. You're protecting the life of someone who tried to kill himself, and you're penalizing someone who's doing something that might be harmful for themselves. So, you know, it's smart, by the way, that cooperative, if you want to check it out on the internet.
Where you can find that?
You can see the way it's being litigated. It's called Sociedad Mexicana de Autoconsumo Responsable y Tolerante.
Ah, está bueno eso.
Yeah.
Entonces, you put this in
you find news
and
about it, and it has now reached the Supreme Court, and we're waiting for a ruling.
Oh, I'm going to search for that. Yeah, we have to go. But
okay.
That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Gracias, Javier.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. Thank you for and congratulations for this report. Armando, muchas gracias. El reporte es Acabando con la guerra contra las drogas de la London School of Economics and Political Science, by the way. It's not only economics. No, it's so. Muchas gracias. Gracias. Hacemos una pausa. Regresamos en un momento más.